Hello everyone. This is my intro for future videos because to be honest, I'm self-conscious about how I look in front of the camera. This will allow me to focus more on what I'm saying. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy my content. It makes a huge difference. I've learned a lot of things while working with audio over the past few years, and I'll share some of them. You can see and hear much of the evidence of what I can do on my YouTube channel. That said, you have to test whatever it is you're doing or you're driving blind. If you want to know what something does, you should overdo it. You'll either hate the results or you'll see the potential in it. Regardless of what YouTube gurus say, it's a good practice to make sure that instruments sound good soloed. In real life, when you have drums that sound like crap, with a guitar that sounds like crap, they will sound like drums and guitar that sound like crap when played together. We always hear sums and interference with sound, regardless of the source. EQ simply serves to even out the frequency spectrum and bring out instruments that you want brought out. When you add an effect like reverb, you'll hear more of that effect on a soloed instrument than in the mix. So you have to go back and forth until that effect sounds good in the mix, even if it sounds over the top on a soloed instrument. You have to prioritize what you want to stand out in a mix. You can't worry about hearing everything at once. For instance, if you have two synth sounds, you should prioritize one. Of course, it's best to prioritize moving lines over sustained sounds. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. For instance, if the bass and kick drum sound good together, don't worry too much about ducking one. If the amplitude spikes too much in certain places, limiting or compressing at the right setting will fix the spikes. You only have to worry about the transients in this case. When you have two instruments with completely different characteristics, you're generally not going to have phase issues. While you don't want to fix what ain't broke, when you play back a mix, you have to listen carefully. If something jumps out or cuts out, you have to figure out what the problem is. More often than not, it's just a matter of looking at how the tracks line up. Then you can nudge one track and the problem is solved. For instance, you can nudge the bass track in the places where there are phase issues. Then the amplitude of the transient is neither doubled nor canceled out. If this doesn't produce results, you might have to do EQ and saturation on both tracks to brighten them. If you need to take it further, you can sidechain the bass to the kick drum to get the bass out of the way. Naturally, you really have to be careful with two sounds with similar characteristics like a hi-hat and a shaker. The timing has to be precise, and it might be a good idea to nudge one of the tracks so that they still sound good together without flams. But you don't want to have harsh attacks. I think it's best to have softer and longer attacks just before short and harder attacks so that there are no flams or gaps. But you don't want a pre-ringing effect from too much misalignment. Regarding bit depth, it's good to know the difference between 24-bit integer and 32-bit float. The resolution is the same, but with 32-bit float, there's a multiplier that gives you a lot more headroom and allows you to go well over the clipping threshold. At high amplitude values, the minimum distance between samples is expanded, and at low amplitude values, the minimum distance between samples is contracted. However, recording at 32-bit float doesn't guarantee no clipping unless your interface supports it. Whether or not you work in 32-bit float depends on your software, but it's best not to unless you're editing your audio files in 32-bit float. If you go over the clipping threshold, your audio might not be processed correctly. It's known that gain staging is important, but what you can do if you're clipping is to add a trim plugin to all your tracks with the same amount of reduction. And if you want to go further to make sure you're not clipping, you can put in limiter plugins after your trim plugins. I would do this on drum tracks especially. I would simply make sure that most of your track doesn't reach the limiter threshold. When it comes to mastering, it's best not to do mastering in your DAW because you can't see the details in your bounces. In this instance, your bounces should be 32-bit float, but only if you test your bounces beforehand to see if they get clipped. Of course, you should not do limiting or compression on your master bus because it would be redundant, since it's being done with mastering software. With designated mastering software, you can see the audio and better see what you're doing. You need to use your ears and your eyes. Here are some things you might need to do. You can tell by looking at the audio. If the audio looks off-centered, you need to do phase rotation. If you see a spike in the audio, you should do limiting because you want to bring down the amplitude on that spike. To get your audio to the desired loudness, you should do clipping. But I don't like clipping too hard because chopped off waveforms are precisely what you're trying to avoid in the first place, given that they can sound distorted. The standard now is -14 LUFs with -1 decibels for headroom. If you do limiting to achieve this, you run the risk of volume fluctuations when limiting lowers the volume. When it comes to sampling rates, 44.1 kHz is fine, especially since nothing can be heard above the Nyquist frequency. Microphones pick up very little over the Nyquist frequency. But if you're doing time stretching or certain audio repairs, you should convert to a higher sampling rate before doing that. You should look at your frequency spectrum because it might tell you when something's off that you won't hear on good speakers, or hear when you become desensitized to your mix. I find that too much bass distorts on my car stereo, and too much upper mids hurts my ears. But I've learned to recognize these problems by looking at the frequency spectrum, and then I adjust the EQ. But I still use my car stereo when I need to be absolutely sure. Ideally, you should do a high-pass and low-pass roll-off at each end of the spectrum if needed to ensure smooth playback on any device. And ideally, your frequency spectrum should be between that of brown noise and pink noise. When it comes to loudness, I will say that getting a mix as loud as possible makes no sense to me unless you're submitting to radio. Nevertheless, I'll show you how I got one of my mixes to -10.5 LUFs with -1 dB headroom. I like to use Isotope RX for mastering. First, I get my mix to 0 dB headroom using gain. If I'm worried about clicks, I'll upsample it and run declick. Many times clicks get into your audio due to digital shortcomings. The RX setting for digital clicks is the safest setting. Then I run a limiter to get it to -13 LUFs and 0 dB headroom. This is a trade-off because otherwise I don't like using limiting to get it this loud. Here's my mix at -13 LUFs and 0 dB headroom.
She sits alone, waiting for suggestions. He's so nervous, avoiding all her questions. His lips are dry, her heart is gently pounding.
Then I use a little bit of saturation and a clipper at the hardest setting to get it to -10.5 LUFs with -1 dB headroom. This keeps the distortion in the high frequencies, where most of it is masked. Then I have to listen carefully to the track and fix parts of it where there's too much distortion or volume fluctuations. I often use the music rebalance feature for volume fluctuations. The deconstruct feature is useful for fixing distortion. You always have to listen carefully to make sure that your track doesn't suddenly change character. If you want the job done right, there is no one size fits all. It's best to get used to manually editing your tracks. And you'll have to run a clipper again to get back your headroom after everything else is finished. Here is my finished track at -10.5 LUFs with -1 dB headroom. Turn down your volume now so that this doesn't hurt your ears.
She sits alone, waiting for suggestions. He's so nervous, avoiding all her questions. His lips are dry, her heart is gently pounding.
Now you can turn your volume back up. When it comes to dither, it's up for debate. but it's a good idea to dither when producing 24-bit or 16-bit masters. Interestingly, 320K MP3 files preserve the dither from 24-bit audio files, but 320K AAC files don't because the dither noise doesn't meet the threshold. Now let's take a look at an isolated vocal from Total Eclipse of the Heart, and I'll show you how I improve it, like I did on my remix. This is a separate video, and the link is in the description and in the info card on your screen. Thanks for watching and listening. Until next time.